Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Sarrouf, and I'm joined today by Joseph Bottum, who is a writer from the Black Hills of South Dakota, and he's written 8 books, including most recently a series of essays called Frankincense, Gold, and Myrrh, a Christmas Chrestomathy, which is perfect for our themed episode in the Christmas season. And we hope you enjoy the episode, and on behalf of everyone at ISI, we wish you a Merry Christmas.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Merry Christmas, Jody. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom.
And your new book, this collection of essays, very apropos for our Christmas-themed episodes. We thought you'd have you on and talk about the season. And this will be coming out on Christmas Eve, so to all of our listeners as well, Merry Christmas. But you've been writing on Christmas for a long time, as I understand it. Now it's coalesced into this collection. And
Well, at some point, Tom, you get reputations when you're a writer. And people then have you on their Rolodex as, oh, he's the guy from South Dakota. So South Dakota story comes up, and I get 3 or 4 phone calls saying, or emails, you want to write about this? Fortunately or unfortunately for my bank account, South Dakota stories don't come up all that often. But somewhere along the line, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I got a reputation as somebody who wrote about Christmas. And it just goes on and on. This year alone, I've written Christmas pieces for the Washington Examiner, the Washington Free Beacon, and the Wall Street Journal. And every year it was like that. Well, you look back over 30 years and you've suddenly got 90 Christmas pieces that you've written. And my poetry publisher is a little press in Notre Dame called St. Augustine's Press. And they've been publishing my poetry for a long time. And they had the idea that maybe I should go back through that stuff, all those Christmas pieces, and see if I couldn't select some. And it was an occasion, Tom, to do something that I had meant to do for a long time. Years ago, Amazon started something called their Kindle Singles series. And I knew an editor there, and that editor asked me for something for Christmas because he felt like they didn't have anything or enough. And I wrote a short story about affable and slightly hangdog gangsters or criminals in the Christmas season. And the next year, I wrote a linked story to that, another 10,000 word story that linked to that. And I meant to write the third, but the editor left and life intruded, and I never wrote it. So when my poetry publisher, when St. Augustine's Press came to me this year and said, why don't we do a selection of Christmas writing? It was an occasion for me to sit down and finally write that third story in the series of short stories, which are really loosely based on the 3 wise men. So I really had to have a third one because you can't do the 2 wise men, And so those 3 stories, 10 to 15,000 words each, open this new book called Frankincense, Gold, and Myrrh. And then I picked 12 Christmas pieces I've written over the years that I thought would fill it in with nonfiction. And there's some comic in there, like there's a piece on tinsel. There's some, perhaps the most mystical thing I've ever written is in there, which is about hearing the voices of the angels in the wind in a winter meadow in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And there's some theological work, my thinking about what the Magi mean, for instance, the 3 wise men, and a lot of memory because Christmas seems to demand it. So I picked 12 pieces running from the late 90s to the last piece is called Christmas and the Boy Reader. And that appeared in the Washington Free Beacon last year. So it kind of covers the range of that. And it was a fun, if melancholy, project to put together, to go back through all this Christmas writing I've done and think, how much of this could I live with? How much of this embarrasses me now? I don't know any writer. You may be the unique exception, Tom, but I don't think I know any writer who actually likes their own writing.
Nope, typically not.
Uh, and uh, and so looking back at this stuff, I thought, oh, that's so terrible. And I ended up picking the 12 that embarrassed me least. But the reviews and the interviews I've done so far seem to suggest that people like it.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. Well, what I read I enjoyed, and I wanted to ask you about your subtitle, which is a Christmas, and hopefully, maybe I'm mispronouncing this, Chrestomathy. What is
The
that?
accent's there on the Tom. Chrestomathy.
Chrestomathy. What is that?
Okay, so Chrestomathy is a word that writers know because H.L. Mencken used it.
Okay.
H.L. Mencken found that word in it. He was kind of a word maven, right? And he found that word. It's a Greek word that means collection or anthology. And he found it somewhere and used it as the title of one of his collections of his newspaper columns called the Mencken Chrestomathy. And then that's how it passed, the knowledge of it passed to every writer of my generation, because every writer of my generation secretly wanted to be H.L. Mencken, to have that kind of voice in the public square. So we all learned this word, and I thought, well, I've got some alliteration, a Christmas Chrestomathy, so let's go ahead and use it.
It's perfect. And then when we're talking about Christmas, I mean, the hope of this conversation is, to sort of elucidate or just consider, just give our listeners something to think about when it comes to this season. There's often this term that I use that I've pulled from somewhere that I heard along the lines on ISI with ISI is that in world history, in philosophy, there is a difference that Christianity makes. Christianity has this once in a universe, once in a historical moment of fundamentally you have before Christ and then after Christ. We changed in the history profession the terms before Common Era but to the Common Era. So that's just kind of a secularizing of before Christ and after Christ. This is the be all end all of when time changes fundamentally. I feel like some of the stories and the themes of the essays in your book touch on this theme of the difference that Christianity makes in history. What is that? What do you make of that? Or what is that? What is the significance of that in your mind?
I think I've always just accepted the fact of it and then tried to build out the consequences, down to my love of the vulgarity of Christmas. I have friends, you have friends, Tom, who think, oh, we need to pare Christmas down to something tasteful and I think, no, give me houses lit up such that they could guide spacecraft in from outer space. Give me inflatable reindeer out on the lawn. I love the mess of Christmas. But why does Christmas grow like that? And to answer that, I think we have to go back to your point and think, well, what difference does it make? And begin maybe with, what is it that happened there? St. Augustine has a really interesting passage in which he says that he could find in the books of the philosophers that in the beginning was the Word. This is from the Gospel of John, the prologue. And he could find in the philosophers the idea that the Word was God and the Word was with God. In other words, philosophy, particularly in a Platonic tradition, can give you thoughts about the divine. and the numinous and the supernatural, right? And its influence as the one or in the good on our understandings of the world. But Augustine then says, the one thing I couldn't find in the philosophers was that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And it's, of course, that one thing that makes all the difference. If Christianity is different from the rest of the ancient world, if a claim is being made there, the claim is not necessarily different because it said there was a divine. For the Greeks thought that. Everyone thought that. It is rather that the divine became flesh and entered time and dwelt among us. And that claim is so radical and so interesting. And we can look back on the 2,000 years since then and see what comes from it, what changed because of it. But we have to remember, first of all, the sheer fact of it. That's what happened. Now, what difference does that happening make? That the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That the Word was incarnate, in the sense there. Francis of Assisi was once asked, the story goes, if it was licit to eat meat on Christmas Day. And he, in other words, what the friars were asking him is Christmas part of the Advent season? Is it a penitential day? Or is it the break away from Advent? And Francis is reported to have shouted, on a day like this, even the walls eat me. And if they do not, let them be smeared with it. And that picture of walls smeared with meat is not going to make any tasteful picture of an elegant Christmas at the Claridge Hotel in London, or House Beautiful. And we can forget that the saints were earthy, strange people. They're not Santa Claus. The saints are something wild and uncontrollable. And Francis is catching that. And of course, what he hears is what we should hear, which is the word for meat is carne. That this is the incarnation, right? Christ is incarnated in this moment. It makes all the difference. And as that difference unfolds, what do we get? We get an idea of progress, of history moving toward a goal. Now, bad can come of this too. The Christian temporal universe has three moments in it. It has creation, it has the Christ event from Bethlehem to Golgotha, from birth to death and resurrection, and then the second coming. And so we have this triplet of events, but they are considered to move in a line. Tom, here's one way to think about it. The history of creation, the soteriological history, the history of salvation, begins in a garden, in the Garden of Eden. And every other ancient account will see us cycling back to that in the goal for humans. We want to return to the garden. The final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, doesn't end in a garden. It ends in a city. And the progression that the Bible gives us, this actual change in time, is not a return to innocence, but a reaching forward to a kind of second innocence, an adult innocence. And we see temporal progress, historical progress, from the garden of childlike innocence to the city of the saints in the book of Revelation, which is different from anything else that we could ever find. And it suggests from the beginning that in the Christian worldview, there is temporal progress. We move through time toward a goal. Now, modernity comes along, modern times comes along, strips Christ out of it, but keeps the idea of progress, and then we end up with all kinds of bad stuff from that, beginning with the idea, or with the point that if you don't know that it's going somewhere, how do you know it's progress and not regression? Progress is an odd word without the goal in mind of what we are progressing to, and probably philosophically incoherent, but on top of everything else. So, but the very idea that even if we stripped God out, we would have an idea of history. We would have an idea of movement in history toward a goal, that toward progress or through progress. That comes from Christianity. And it blossoms at various points after the recovery from the collapse of the Roman Empire. It blossoms in the 13th century in Paris. It blossoms in Renaissance Italy. It blossoms in the birth of modernity. And we see these sudden rushes of knowledge, information, and thought. And they often, they're born of this idea, I think, that the universe is intelligible, and the universe that we perceive, the earthy incarnated universe, is meaningful because God himself descended in the flesh to save the people there, became material. And that's an example. Now, there are others that we could take up. You and I, we could talk about this for hours, but, this is at least one example of what it means or what the consequences are of making that central claim that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And the moment we celebrate that, of course, is Christmas.
It's so amazing to consider because it is sort of the opposite of what came before, with at least within sort of the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition that is still in Western civilization amongst us very like revered in many circles. But there is sort of like a juxtaposition between the I guess the God humbling himself and becoming man, becoming one of us, versus the Platonic assent to the ideal, the beingly being, the good or the idea of God, which is beyond materiality or corporeality. Um, it's a sort of an opposite of the Greek world, where matter is, if not evil, in the way that maybe Gnostics consider it in like the first and second century. There's a sort of a celebration of our material or our particular facets of life in Christianity, an affirmation of that as part of the creation and the divine order. And what I'd be curious to hear your perspective on is I get a sense that we are talking about all sorts of ideas, and I think today that are abstracted from um, our material conditions or our particular time and place, that would be affirmed under this sort of paradigm of thinking about the incarnation. Um, what do you? This is something that Edmund Burke critiques. Is you have with the French Revolution the philosophers who are making abstract reason about the rights of man, but they don't know anything about any particular man or woman. Um, and do you have a sense for maybe how Christianity today or Christmas today would give us a sense for a rootedness in a particular time and place that Christ came down at a particular moment in time in history?
Well, I don't think you can scrub out all of the theology from Christmas, but Christmas is a big thing. It's the biggest thing the world has ever seen. And it would eat up the world if it could. And it does. You've seen this in your own lifetime. When I was young, there were not Christmas decorations up or Christmas carols playing in the grocery stores before Halloween. I mean, Christmas really has grown and grown. It would eat up the world if it could. And of course, it has eaten up Advent. People don't perceive Advent as a penitential season typically anymore. And the biggest, most obvious of these changes is the idea that the 12 days of Christmas are somehow from the 13th of December to the 25th instead of the days after Christmas running down to 12th night. But I hesitate, Tom, to condemn that. Partly that's because I love vulgarity. I love the wildness of the season. I love, you know, I we went to a church for years where they would put poinsettias out in the aisle, right? Not just tastefully up on either side of the altar, but running down the aisle. And to get to communion, you'd have to sort of step over them, and it was awkward, and everybody's sort of stumbling. And of course, there's some older woman with a walker trying to get up to take communion, and the people are moving the poinsettias out of her way, and it's a mess, and it's awkward, and it slows everything down. And you know what, Tom? I love it. I love the mess of it because it feels to me earthy. And those inflatable reindeer, yeah, they're not Christmas, but they're not Christmas because the people who are doing all of this stuff, covering their houses with lights and baking fruit cakes that weigh like depleted uranium, and that they're just doing all this stuff. My wife would put out maybe 25 creches around the house. One creche would do, but no, she had a set of them and she would just put them out. And I think you gotta understand that we are not, these people are being dim, but you and I are dim too. They're being foolish, but we're all foolish, They are doing as best they can, what they can, to honor the season, to participate in this impossible, extraordinary thing. And, are there more theologically correct ways to do it? Absolutely. But that doesn't make these wrong. It makes them, like a medieval festival. And these medieval religious festivals were full of, people trying to seduce each other in the streets, and masks and parades and bonfires, and yet somehow at the center of it would be St. Lucy's Day, or Carnival, or it's somehow there was still this religious thing at the center of all this vulgarity, of all this silliness, of all the lords of misrule running down to Twelfth Night that characterized the old sense of Christmas in the octave after Christmas, and the set of days after Christmas. And you know what? I like that. And our modern version of it has shifted it to before Christmas, for various reasons, some raw commercialism. But even that, I embrace it. You're not going to win against the Christmas, if you set yourself against it. You're not going to win. So you might as well surrender to the nuttiness of it, because Christmas itself does not make sense. The human mind cannot cobble up a full and complete explanation for why God himself descended in the flesh and dwelt among us. And so, I like all of that. And it seems to me to be incarnated in very important and ways, So cook the goose, Tom, go ahead, make the stuffing and say, God bless us, everyone, and sing the stupid carols because they're wonderful, I mean, think of I've written before, Tom, about carols, Christmas carols. I've written several Christmas carols myself. But, I've written about what they are. Lots of them are Victorian inventions. They try to sound old, right? But they're Victorian invention. Some of them drive me crazy. Good King Wenceslas takes what was a really fine Easter anthem, melody of an Easter anthem, and sticks it back in Christmas with a ridiculous narrative of a Polish king stuck on it in English. But all of them are a little strange. Even just think of the grammar in God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, right? It's hard to miss that one, right? You knew it before you knew that you knew it. Mm-hmm. It was just present in the air when you were a child. But think about it, the language of it, for instance, that Jesus Christ is born. And do you remember the rhyme for that?
Not off the top of my head. If you gave me the melody, I might be able to.
Jesus Christ is born, the which his mother Mary did nothing take in scorn. And the witch, WHICH, right, is not a construction we use very much anymore. But
Right.
somehow, we just sort of sing along with it. It's filled, they're often filled with make rhymes, where you stick an extra word like aha on the end of the line to get the rhyme, or they say stuck on. Um, some of it is willful. I wonder as I wander out under the sky how Jesus the Savior did come for to die. The grammar is Victorian, but it's also awkward Victorian because it's being written by people who are not poets. Right? They're just trying to make the rhyme, and yet it wrenches my heart out every time I hear them. There's a Christmas carol every year that just catches me and pulls me in to the spirit of the season. And I've learned to surrender to it, to figure it's going to be one of them, you know. One year it was Down in Yon Forest, which is a 16th century, maybe 16th century British carol. Another year it was when I heard a recording of this boy soprano with one of the, how boy sopranos sound when they're good, this bell-like voice singing Once in Royal David City. And I just felt myself falling off the cliff for that. One time it was a country western version of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. I can never predict what it's going to be that's going to catch me. But I have learned that part of my acceptance of the strangeness and the wonder of the season and it in its earthiness and its instantiatedness um, is requires surrendering to it, to accept that one carol this year is going to be the one that lassos you and pulls you down off the cliff into this mush. And a lot of that, Tom, too, is melancholy. Not all of it, right? I know we're called to joy in the season, but it's bound up in memory of childhood, memory of those who are gone. Um, children. Do you have children, Tom?
No, not yet.
Uh, you will find that they are the biggest, the sternest enforcers of tradition for Christmas that is possible. Perhaps you were like this with your parents. I know my own daughter would say, "Well, no, we can't change what we have for dinner Christmas Eve. It's a tradition, and she would be disappointed if we did it. She doesn't even like it that much, but it's a tradition. And
It's
if you
Christmas. It's what you do.
right, exactly. And a tradition isn't a tradition if you change it because you don't like it. In fact, maybe the definition of tradition is doing things we don't like just because we've always done them that way. And so this is all for me wrapped up in the Christmas season, um, the redolence of it, the odors of Christmas, the pine and the candles, uh, and the smell of the cooking. This is all caught for me in Christmas and the Boy Reader. I talk about how I grew up with books, that Christmas was books and books Christmas. We just every year at Christmas we get all these books, and I'd sit in bed afterwards, at night when we're all supposed to be asleep, but we're reading in bed, and I can remember the tactile feel of the books and the smell, the new book smell of ink and freshly opened pages and the slipperiness of the dust jackets and sorting the books I had gotten into piles, those I was going to read later and those I needed to look at right away. And that memory in Christmas and the Boy Reader, that essay, is deeply tied to Christmas, as it should be. But it's not a depression, it's a melancholy, which is possibly related to joy.
As you're speaking, I'm feeling it right now, thinking about, my sister and I waiting to get up on Christmas morning for my parents to go down so that they can be downstairs first to turn on all the lights so that she and I can run down and be excited about the presents or, listening to the Tony Bennett Christmas uh, CD on our little boom box that you plug in. Now everything's done on the phones, but um, no, I see what you mean. And if I were to sum it up in a word, or don't be a Scrooge. Um, Now, at the same time, I'd be curious to hear what you think about, because you did mention there is a maybe more theologically proper way. When you read the night prayer during Advent, it says, as we wait for through the long night of Advent, waiting for, a star is born, um, and the shepherds go, and the Christ child is there in the manger. This is the dawning of the light that was with God at the beginning of time, now come down. So we're waiting in anticipation for Christ. So there, if there is a more theologically proper way, and now in late modernity we have a more commercial, secular sense of Christmas. I wonder if you have any thoughts about what we might do, or in ways in which we might behave to, if not restore, but to maybe firm up again this more theologically rich, or theologically rich conception of what Christmas is about.
Well, yes, the answer to that is yes, there are things, one of which is sing the better Christmas carols. O come, Emmanuel. If you actually read the verses, they're a straight walk through the lessons and carols of the late Advent season. There's just, come thou day spring, come, each one of them is the verse there. And the theological sense there is actually fairly simple for all that it's deep, which is, as what we've been talking about, the incarnation of God, the blessedness of the Virgin Mary, the whole scene that Luke gives us, tied to its great abstraction in theological language in the beginning of the Gospel of John. We get this message of what it was, that Jesus was from the beginning, and yet, from the beginning, he was the second person of the Trinity, through whom, like a lens, everything was made. The second person of the Trinity is the locus of the eternal truths, because through that, all that is was made. But it also descends in the flesh, and that story is so symbolically rich. Let me give you one example of the richness, okay, of these stories. We could do this with the shepherds, we could do this with the animals, we could do this with the manger, we could do this with Bethlehem. Each of these is so thick. But take the three wise men. Now, the Gospels are not clear at all when they arrive. There's some readings that say Jesus is like 3 years old by the time they arrive. There are others that suggest, other parts of the tradition that suggest it was very early. And of course, modern Christmas symbology puts them there like at the moment of birth. The creche will have the shepherds and the wise men all present at once, right? With the kneeling cattle and the rest of it. But the wise men, to arrive, whenever they did arrive, they had to start out much earlier. They're not like the shepherds, hearing the angel say, go down to Bethlehem and see. And then they just come down the hill. The shepherd or the wise men are from very far away. So they had to set out. And the angel didn't appear to them. So what caused them to set out? Well, they had read the stars, which was the best available science of the time. You and I know it's not really good science, but it was what they had, right? And they read the signs that some great event is happening. And they come from the east. They travel west a long way. A cold coming they had of it. Lancelot Andrewes preached at the beginning of the 17th century on his Christmas Day sermon. And that line T.S. Eliot picks up in his own poem for the Magi, about the Magi. So they had to set out, they had to read the stars, understand, according to their lights, what it meant, and then set out on this long journey with no other assurance except the power of the mind. The Magi, the three wise men, are saints of the intellect. The shepherds are the easy faith, right? They believe, they hear the angels. It's really hard to say, oh, I don't believe it when the angels are telling you to do this and they're swirling in the sky, right? The faith, in a sense, the faith of the shepherds is easy. Especially, I intend this for people like you and me, right? What's hard is the faith of the wise men, because they had to think their way through to a conclusion and believe that the world was intelligible enough that the conclusions that thought comes to lead to truth. And they did. They saw the truth itself. And this is, there are other ways to read the wise men, the magi, but this is an example of what I mean by those stories in the gospel and that the tradition offers are deep. You can start unfolding them and it just keeps going down and down and down into the depths of understanding. And we could, as I said, we could do this with the shepherds. We could do this with every element of the story. And of course, a lifetime of being a churchgoer, a lifetime of being a Bible reader, a lifetime of being a Christian, a lifetime of being a believer enriches this. And then, of course, Christmas is a particularly special time when the gap between the numinous and the mundane, between the otherworldly and the thisworldly, feels thin, like there's a lot leaking through to make this world, what was the word you used? Rich. To make this world a rich world, rich with meaning, rich with symbolism, thick in the Clifford Geertz's sociological terms, where things relate to each other and have meaning and purpose and seem to shine with an interior light of creation. And, look, we live in a pretty thin age in terms of this kind of extra meaning of things. We live where what we perceive in material objects is the naked shingles of the world. They don't care about us. They have no caring. They are just the raw stuff. And the sea of faith, in Matthew Arnold's terms, the sea of faith once clothed those rocks with meaning and purpose. And most of the time, Tom, you and I live in a world in which we don't get to see that a lot. But at Christmas, I look out and I see the snow and it feels right and meaningful and rich and wonderful. And I look at the trees here in the Black Hills, these pine trees and these spruce, and I look at the houses and the decorations, and everything feels like it has meaning and purpose. Not the best possible meaning, not the thickest possible meaning, but I live in a world where I think we all live in a world of late modernity where let's take our meaning where we can get it. And there it is at Christmas, all kind of laid out, even to walk down the street in the big city and see the Salvation Army guys ringing their bells with their little red kettles, and to see the windows in Manhattan soaked with candy canes, or the really elegant, expensive layouts of Christmas in the stores up on Park Avenue. New York is a wonderful Christmas town still, I think. Although I haven't been back since COVID. I don't know what COVID did to it, but before COVID, at least, New York was a wonderful Christmas town. And that felt, even to walk the streets of New York City, was to feel this leakage, making things meaningful, shining them in a new light. And that, I think, is the gift that Christmas gives us even now.
Is there a way that you're celebrating Christmas this year in light of this sort of spirit? Because there is like an anticipation always. Once you get to the end of the year, the end brings forth a new beginning with the new year, but you're ending with this great celebration. And so there's this sort of push to, I mean, I think there's also the sort of commercial piece that we were talking about earlier of, if we can get the Christmas shopping started before Halloween, get people into the Christmas spirit, and you start getting these deals, and you have deals all day long from, the end of October all the way through New Year's and then beyond, and that's a great way to make a lot of money if you're a business. But there's also this sort of like anticipation. So I guess there are a lot of maybe controversies in a sort of in a fun or a silly way of like, oh well, when's too early to listen to Christmas music, or when is too
Sure.
early to put your Christmas tree up? How do you do it?
Well, I've been slow this year. My daughter just arrived from New York, and she's going to be putting up more Christmas decorations that I didn't have time or the energy to do anymore now that I'm by myself. But, I think part of it is, we're going to adhere to the tradition. We're going to have those meals that we've always had on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. We're going to go to church. We're going to try and feel the season on the days after Christmas. I'll tell you one thing that does bother me, Tom. In this capacious, I love the mess of the season, anything goes, because it's all really trying to find an inchoate way to celebrate the central fact. I realize this is what I've been saying. Anything goes as long as it's rich and thick and fun and odd. One thing that bothers me, the people who throw their Christmas tree out the day after Christmas and take down their decorations.
Mhm.
The people who end the season, bam, on the 25th, and boast about it. Well, I got everything Christmassy put away before New Year's. And I think, no, keep it going. Keep it going as long as you can. Let that tree turn yellow, right? And the needles fall off and create a fire hazard because it's so dried out. Do that rather than try and cut off the season. And so, I realize it's kind of hypocritical of me to condemn that in the midst of saying I love the mess of the season. But no, I want it to go on. I want to have a house full of people and have time to do jigsaw puzzles, the 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle on the folding leg bridge table, that gets set up because that's what I want. I want the company. I want the satisfaction and the melancholy of memory, and to look out at the hills here covered with snow and pines and think of my own childhoods and how it snowed when I was young, and just feel the all of it, the whole of it. And that's what I'd recommend for anyone is just, let yourself surrender to it. Let yourself go.
Well, Jody, we are basically out of time. I've really appreciated and enjoyed sitting here and listening to you talk about the joys of Christmas and this sort of happy surrender to the maybe the charming vulgarities that we pursue in the pursuit and the anticipation and excitement of this time. You mentioned poems, and so I said to you beforehand I'd end by asking you if you'd recite a poem for us to close. So what do you
Well,
got?
the trouble is, I don't have any Christmas poems, Tom. Every time I try and write one, it turns into a bouncy Christmas carol, and then I send it to a friend to set to music. So I've written four books of poetry, and there's not a Christmas poem in them, which is kind of surprising because they're Easter poems, But somehow my Christmas thoughts. Maybe it's because I get sort of burned out on this, but here's one, a short one, um, called Homecoming. And it's when I decided that I would come back to South Dakota and not stay in Washington or New York and look for something new to sort of stay in the public eye. And it's called Homecoming. And it goes, sometimes I dream I'm flying just above the plain, the world in wheat beneath me, the rivers rich with rain. And there I hear the murmur of what the old land knows. All journeys need an ending. All circles long to close.
Jody, Merry Christmas. Thank you very much.
Merry Christmas, Tom. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.